James. Find yourself a real job.
On a Wednesday morning in April of 1982, Sandra Whitmore pointed her finger across the desk and laughed. Not a quiet laugh, the kind meant to carry across the showroom floor, past the green John Deere tractors, all the way to the plastic waiting chair where an 8-year-old girl named Maya Calhoun sat, holding her father's jacket. Maya looked up. She went still. She did not look away. "Honey," Sandra leaned forward, gold earrings catching the light. "I don't know who told you that 120 acres of bottomland in Shorter is a farm. That's a headache. Sell it. Find yourself a real job and let a real operation take that ground." She smiled like she was doing him a favor. No one in the showroom moved. A salesman stopped writing. A mechanic in the back doorway froze. 2 customers turned, not to look at Sandra, but at James, at the mud on his boots, at the dried crack across his knuckle from the irrigation pipe he'd repaired at 5 that morning before driving 22 miles to get here. James Earl Calhoun was 34 years old. He had $600 in his shirt pocket, his grandfather's land deed beside it, a broken tractor back home, and 45 days before the planting window closed. His daughter was 10 feet away, watching every second. He looked at Sandra. He looked at Maya. He looked back. "Do you have a used tractor for sale?" he said quietly. "Or not?" What Sandra Whitmore said next would define the next 20 years of both their lives. But to understand what it ultimately cost her, you need to first understand what was already buried in that Alabama ground, long before James ever walked through her door. Subscribe right now, because what this man built with $600 and land everyone told him to sell is one of the most powerful stories you will ever hear. To understand James Earl Calhoun, you have to understand the man who made him. Elias Calhoun bought 120 acres of bottomland outside Shorter, Alabama in 1944 for $1,800. Every dollar he had, earned over 11 years working double shifts at a cotton gin in Montgomery. He was told the land was too wet, too stubborn, too much trouble for a black man to work alone in Macon County. He paid cash anyway, signed a deed on a Tuesday afternoon, and drove home to start clearing before the sun went down. Elias farmed those 120 acres for 37 years. He never missed a property tax payment. He never owed a bank a dollar he couldn't pay back by harvest. And every fall, after the crops came in, he planted cover crops, crimson clover, winter rye into the stubble, while his neighbors called it wasted seed and wasted money. Elias never argued with them. He just kept planting. James grew up on that land. He drove a tractor at 11, fixed a broken rear axle at 15, using tools his grandfather had owned since before James was born. By the time he was 20, he could read soil moisture by feel, the way other men read a clock, slowly, carefully, always looking for what was underneath. He met Clara in 1973. They married in 1975. Maya was born in 1974, a year before the wedding, because life doesn't always follow the order you plan. Clara was warm and sharp and laughed at things nobody else found funny, and James loved her in the quiet, constant way that men like him love things, without saying much about it, because the doing was the saying. Clara died in November of 1979, brain aneurysm. She was 31 years old. Maya was 6. James held the funeral on a Tuesday and was back in the field by Thursday, not because he wasn't broken, but because the field didn't know anyone had died and Maya still needed to eat. Elias passed in the spring of 1981. He left James the 120 acres, a 1964 John Deere 420 with a cracked engine block, and a farmhouse with a wood-burning stove that still threw heat. He also left something else, something James wouldn't find for another 8 months. But that comes later. The 40-20 failed completely in March of 1982, beyond repair. James had $600, 45 days, and one equipment dealer within 30 miles. He put Maya in the truck and drove to Whitmore Equipment on Highway 80. He already knew what kind of reception he was likely to get. He went anyway, because Elias Calhoun hadn't raised a man who let a locked door be the end of the story. James drove home from Whitmore Equipment with his daughter in the passenger seat and Sandra Whitmore's laughter still sitting in the cab between them like a third passenger. Maya didn't ask what happened. She'd been there. She'd seen every second of it. She just looked out the window at the Alabama flatland rolling past and said nothing the whole 22 miles home. James said nothing either. He was already thinking. 2 weeks later, he heard about an estate auction in Elmore County, 35 miles east, old equipment, the kind of sale where things go cheap because nobody knows what they're looking at. He drove out on a Saturday morning with his $600, every dollar he had in the world. He bid on a 1959 John Deere 730, faded green paint, rear tires worn down to the weave, sitting at the far end of the auction line like something that had already been given up on. The auctioneer asked for $800, got silence, asked for $6. James raised his hand. Nobody else moved. He paid $480 and drove it home on a borrowed flatbed, with $120 left to his name. An older man walked up before James pulled out of the lot. Earl Simmons, 68 years old, farmed 300 acres east of Shorter, and had seen enough auctions to know what a real farmer looked like when he was buying. He studied the 730 for a moment, then looked at James. "You know how to work on that machine?" James said. "My grandfather ran one just like it." Earl nodded once. "Then you'll be all right." He walked away. That was all. No pity, no performance. Just one farmer recognizing another. James spent the next 22 days in his grandfather's workshop, rebuilding that 730. New fuel injectors, new hydraulic seals, full electrical overhaul. He worked at night after Maya was asleep, under a single bulb hanging from a ceiling hook, using Elias's tools, following notes Elias had penciled into the margins of an equipment manual from 1966. The handwriting was faded in places. James read every word. By the second week of May, the 730 was running. He planted 70 acres of soybeans and 50 acres of corn. He did everything alone, plowing, planting, cultivating, up before dawn, still moving when he couldn't see his hands in the dark. The neighbors watched, talked, shook their heads. That Calhoun man is going to lose that place by Christmas. Somebody ought to tell him. He'll be done by fall, guaranteed. Maya heard it at school. A boy told her straight to her face that her daddy was going to fail. She came home, said nothing about it, and asked if she could bring James water while he worked in the field. She carried a thermos out every afternoon that summer without being asked once. Sandra Whitmore drove out in July. She didn't get out of her car. She rolled the window down, looked at the old 730 sitting in the yard, looked at the crops stretching to the tree line, and said, "Just checking on things, James." James wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her. "I'm fine, Miss Whitmore." She drove away without another word, but she'd seen enough to know the old machine was running. What she didn't know, what nobody in Tuskegee County knew yet, was why it was running so well. Harvest came in October. 70 acres of soybeans yielded 31 bushels per acre. 50 acres of corn yielded 104 bushels. After taxes, seed costs, and fuel, James had $3,900 left. He put every dollar in the bank and didn't touch it. But November was coming, and November was going to be the hardest thing James Calhoun had faced since the Tuesday he buried his wife. The crops were harvested. The fields were empty, and the farmhouse got quiet in the way it only gets quiet when there are 2 people inside it where there used to be 3. November in Macon County comes in cold and flat. The wind off the open fields steady and low, the kind of cold that doesn't shock you. It just settles in and stays. James sat at the kitchen table one evening with his bank statement and a pencil. $3,900. That was everything. One equipment failure he couldn't fix, one drought, one bad season, and the farm was gone. The numbers didn't lie, and James wasn't the kind of man who needed them to. He was one disaster away from losing everything Elias had spent 37 years building. For the first time since he'd driven that 7:30 home on a borrowed flatbed, he heard Sandra Whitmore's voice in his head, clear as the day she said it. Sell it. Find yourself a real job. Let a real operation take that ground. Maya turned 9 in November. Clara had always made birthday cakes, a particular one, yellow with chocolate frosting, nothing fancy, but Maya loved it because her mother made it. James tried to make it from memory. It didn't rise right. He waited until Maya was asleep, threw it in the trash, drove 12 miles to a grocery store at 10 o'clock at night, bought one off the shelf, and was back before she woke up. Nobody saw that. Nobody wrote about that. But that is what holding on looks like from the inside. In December, James was called to Maya's school. Her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Aldridge, not unkind, told him that Maya had been struggling to concentrate, that she seemed tired, that she worried. She said, gently, "Mr. Calhoun, your daughter is carrying something heavy for a 9-year-old. She's worried about the farm. She's worried about you." James drove home without speaking. He sat in the truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before he could make himself go inside. 3 days later, he drove to Whitmore Equipment. He told himself he was going to the feed store. He didn't go to the feed store. He parked across the street from the dealership, engine running, and sat there. Through the plate glass window, he could see Sandra at her desk, laughing with a customer, pointing at a new tractor on the floor. Clean hands, white blazer, gold earrings. He thought about how simple it would be. Walk in, tell her she was right, ask her to help him find a buyer, get a job in town, give Maya a normal life. Stop worrying about rain and rust and whether that 7:30 would make it through another season. He looked in the rear-view mirror. In the truck bed, half visible under a tarp, was Elias's toolbox, the one his grandfather had carried since 1952. His name scratched into the metal in block letters, still readable 30 years later. James stared at it for a long moment. He thought about something Elias had told him when he was 12, the summer they pulled the engine on the 4020 together in the workshop. His grandfather had looked at him across the block and said, "James, anybody can quit. Takes nothing at all. The hard thing is walking back into that barn the next morning like you never thought about it." James took his hand off the door handle, put the truck in gear, drove home. He never told a single person about that morning. Not for 20 years. Not until he told Maya. 4 days after Christmas, James was cleaning out the back bedroom where Elias had slept for 40 years. Behind a stack of old hymnals on the bottom shelf, he found a large print King James Bible, the cover worn soft from decades of handling. He opened it. Between the pages, folded carefully, dozens of them, were papers. Soil notes, field maps, rotation records going back to 1949. Elias had been documenting the bottomland for 33 years. Every field, every season, every observation. Rainfall totals, soil temperature readings, organic matter estimates, worm counts taken by hand, notes on which cover crops cut his fertilizer costs and by exactly how much. Diagrams showing a 7-year rotation cycle that nobody else in Macon County was running. On the inside that cover, written in a hand shakier than the rest, sometime in 1980 or 1981, near the very end, Elias had written, "James, the land looks rougher than it is. I've been feeding it since before you were born. It's ready. Don't sell it to anybody, for any price. It's worth more than they will ever offer you. Trust what's already in the ground." James sat on the floor of that back bedroom and did not move for a long time. Then he dried his face, carried the Bible to the kitchen table, and started reading from the beginning. What Elias had left him wasn't just land. It was a 33-year head start that nobody in Tuskegee County knew existed. And 1983 was about to prove it in ways that would leave Sandra Whitmore with nothing left to say. James followed the Bible like a blueprint. Every rotation Elias had documented, he ran. Every cover crop his grandfather had seeded into the stubble each fall, crimson clover, winter rye, James seeded too, while every farmer within 20 miles called it wasted money and wasted time. He lived below what he earned, saved aggressively, never carried a dollar of debt, never signed a loan document, never let a bank get close enough to matter. The results came slowly. Then they came all at once. By 1985, James's soybean yields were running 18% above the Macon County average. His corn did better in dry summers because the bottomland, Elias's bottomland, built up through 33 years of cover crops and careful rotation, held moisture 2 to 3 weeks longer than any comparable field in the area. The soil had structure, it had depth, it had organic matter that his neighbor's ground, mined year after year without anything put back, simply didn't have anymore. In the drought summer of 1986, when half the county's corn failed outright, James's fields yielded 91 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 48. People noticed. Not with respect, not yet, with confusion. How was the Calhoun man outproducing farms with twice the equipment and 3 times the fertilizer budget? Nobody asked James. Nobody thought to ask a black man farming alone on inherited bottomland about agronomy. So they just watched and stayed confused. Sandra Whitmore was doing well through the early 80s. New equipment moved fast during the boom years. Farmers were buying bigger tractors, taking on bigger loans, expanding into more acres. Sandra financed all of it. Every sale was a commission. Every loan was a relationship. She stopped by James's property once a year. Always the same conversation. Still running that old 730? Still running it. How? Same way my grandfather taught me. You take care of the machine takes care of you. Sandra would shake her head and drive away. It became a ritual, almost a joke. Except James wasn't joking. Then 1981 hit, and the world Sandra's customers had borrowed their way into came apart like sheet metal in a hailstorm. Interest rates spiked to 21%. Grain prices collapsed. Land values fell through the floor. Farmers who had borrowed to expand found themselves owing more than everything they owned combined. In Macon County, 29 farms went to foreclosure between 1983 and 1988. Auctions every Saturday. Families gone. Equipment sold for nothing. Generational land lost in an afternoon to the highest bidder. Sandra Whitmore's dealership began bleeding in 1984. The loans she'd written during the boom years were going bad one by one. Farmers couldn't pay. She couldn't cover her creditors. The gleaming showroom that had once held 8 new John Deeres sat half empty and getting emptier. James showed up to every foreclosure auction in the county. Not to gloat. He showed up because Earl Simmons had once looked at him with recognition instead of pity. And James understood what it meant to have someone show up. In 1985, he bought 80 acres from an estate sale near Shorter. $34,000 cash, no bank, no loan. In 1987, he bought 60 more acres from a foreclosure 2 miles south, $22,500 cash. By 1988, James Calhoun owned 260 acres, all of it free and clear, all of it paid in full. Maya was 14. Every Sunday evening she sat at the kitchen table, with a yellow legal pad and a calculator and helped James with the books. She never complained. She never asked to be somewhere else. She just sat there, under the kitchen light, working the numbers the way her father had taught her, carefully, honestly, without rounding anything up. Neither of them knew yet that the most important conversation of the next 20 years was already coming. It would arrive on a Tuesday morning in March of 2002, exactly 20 years after James had walked out of that showroom, with his daughter's hand in his and Sandra Whitmore's laughter at his back. If you've stayed this far, you already know this story is different. Subscribe now, because what happens next between James Calhoun and Sandra Whitmore is not what anyone expected. Not even James. Whitmore Equipment closed on a Monday morning in March of 2002, 20 years, 3 months, and 9 days after Sandra Whitmore pointed her finger across a desk and laughed at a man with $600 and a land deed in his shirt pocket. The bank called the final loans on a Friday. By Monday morning, strangers were walking the showroom floor, putting price tags on everything she had spent 2 decades building. That same week, Sandra drove to the Calhoun farm. She sat at the end of the driveway in her car for a long time before she got out. James was in the workshop, replacing a water pump on the old 730, still running, still working, 43 years old, and not done yet. He heard tires on the gravel and looked out. He saw her standing at the fence, smaller than he remembered, the white blazer replaced by a plain gray coat, the gold earrings gone. He walked out and stood across from her. She said, "James, I closed the dealership this week." He said, "I heard. I'm sorry." Sandra laughed, a short, broken sound with nothing of that showroom laugh left in it. "You're sorry. I told you to sell your land, told you to find a real job, and you're standing here telling me you're sorry." James looked at her steadily. "Losing something you built is painful. Doesn't matter who it happens to." Silence stretched between them. Then Sandra said, "How much land do you own now?" James told her, 260 acres, all paid for, all free and clear. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were red. "I helped push 29 farmers in this county into debt they couldn't survive. And I laughed at the one man who never listened to me." She stopped. She had nothing left to add, because there was nothing left to say. James didn't answer right away. He looked at Sandra Whitmore standing at his fence, in a gray coat with nothing left to defend, and he said the last thing she expected to hear. "Your daughter Renee has been asking around about farm work. I heard it from Earl Simmons's grandson." Sandra stared at him. James said, "Send her to me. I'll put her to work." Sandra couldn't find words. James leaned against the fence post and said simply, "My grandfather believed the land belongs to whoever will take care of it. That's the only qualification that ever mattered." Sandra drove away. James stood in the yard and watched her taillights disappear down the county road. He didn't feel victory. He felt something quieter than that. Something closer to the feeling you get when a long season finally ends. James farmed until 2012, 30 years total. He expanded to 480 acres, every acre paid in full, not a dollar borrowed, not a bank involved. When he retired, he leased the land to Maya on terms she could afford. He gave her the Bible. He gave her Elias's field notes. He told her exactly what Elias had told him. Trust what's already in the ground. The 1959 John Deere 730 ran until 2009. 50 years of service. James retired it to the back of the barn, cleaned and maintained. It still starts. He says now, quietly, when people ask how he did it, "My grandfather didn't leave me land. He left me 33 years of somebody else's belief in something they'd never lived to see finished. You can't buy that. You can't borrow it. You can only carry it forward." Right now, somebody is being told to sell what they built and walk away. Somebody's being laughed at for doing it the slow way, the careful way, the hard way. James Calhoun was told he wasn't serious. His grandfather was told his land wasn't worth keeping. The ground remembered everything Elias put into it. And 20 years later, the man who was laughed at owned more land than the woman who laughed. If this story moved you, subscribe right now for more stories about the people who built something real when everyone told them they couldn't. Drop a comment and tell me, has anyone ever told you that what you were building wasn't worth the effort? And were you right in the end?